Hi, I'm Dr. Pallav Mehta. I am a breast cancer medical oncologist at MD Anderson Cancer Center at Cooper in New Jersey. And I also am the director of integrative oncology at the Cancer Center. So I was asked today to talk about an important topic, which is the role of integrative medicine in breast cancer survivorship. We'll begin with my story, which begins about 6 years in. I emigrated to the United States when I was just past my sixth birthday, and I remember the first few years of my life living in a one-bedroom apartment with my sister, my parents, and my grandmother who would sleep in the living room. And every morning, I would come out, get dressed for school, and my grandmother would have this concoction waiting for me, which I dreaded because it really didn't taste very good at all. But what this included was whole milk, crushed almonds, some sugar, and turmeric. And my grandmother would tell me that this is what'll make me strong and this is what will clean my blood. Little did I know how prophetic she was. So now we'll move forward to Melissa's story. Melissa is a patient of mine who 2 years ago, at 37 years old and 34 weeks into her pregnancy, suddenly noticed a red, swollen breast and was diagnosed immediately with a stage 3 inflammatory breast cancer. 2 weeks later, she was induced. The baby was healthy, and then she began a course of chemotherapy that lasted 4 months, had a double mastectomy, lymph node dissection, radiation. During this time, she was also found to have a genetic mutation that put her at risk of of ovarian cancer. And so she underwent a surgery to have her ovaries removed and then started a medication to block estrogen. She underwent a reconstruction later of her breasts, but one of her implants failed and it had to be removed. So we flash forward 1 year later, and Melissa was depressed, anxious, irritable from menopause, among many other things. Her hair was not growing back well. She really didn't think she bonded well with her baby. She had nerve damage, neuropathy from her chemotherapy. She really was unhappy with how the right chest looked as the implant was removed. And she had gained weight. She had pain and hot flashes. And even her heart function had dropped from chemotherapy, not to mention the financial and social issues related to bankruptcy and her marriage. So this is Melissa's PET scan. And for anyone who looks at PET scans, this is actually a completely clean PET scan. So Melissa's cancer free, but what I want to talk about today is this idea that does cancer free really mean healthy? So health is something as an oncologist we think about a lot. Um, what is health? And I go back to a definition that was coined decades ago from the World Health Organization's first principle from their initial constitution, which is that health is a state of complete physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So I often, when I have medical students, residents, and fellows, this is something I will tell them upfront, which is that they need to understand that they're not really treating cancer; they're treating people, and that's the lens that we should use to look at all of our patients, but particularly patients with a cancer diagnosis. And the father of medicine, Hippocrates, said that it's more important to know what sort of person has a disease than to know what sort of disease a person has. So why is cancer on the rise? Well, we are certainly diagnosing it more as people are having more and more tests in the emergency room, at their doctor's offices, more CAT scans and MRIs, bone scans. We also have a population that's aging. And despite the fact that we are seeing more younger women with breast cancer, we still, the average age is still above 60. We have more women cured of breast cancer, and we also have more and more women with stage 4 breast cancer that are living longer and more productive lives. So this has led to a significant increase in survivors, in breast cancer survivors. And the estimate in a few years is almost 20 million cancer survivors, many of whom have a breast cancer diagnosis. Survivorship, which is this whole idea of managing patients after a diagnosis of cancer, really starts at diagnosis, and it continues for the rest of a patient's life. It deals with the immediate and long-term consequences of both the cancer and the treatment on physical health, emotional, psychosocial health, even financial health, as the term financial toxicity begins to permeate our day to day as these treatments get more and more expensive and insurance is covering less and less, and the onus is often more on patients. So over 20 years ago, the National Institutes of Health established what was then known as the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine, and the word alternative was changed to complementary and integrative health about 10 years later. So what is integrative medicine? Well, the idea is that it combines mainstream medical therapy and complementary therapy for which there's high quality scientific evidence of safety and effectiveness. And again, language does matter. In my mind, alternative medicine is what is done in lieu of standard treatment. Integrative medicine is what's done in conjunction with. In breast cancer, integrative medicine is utilized by upwards of 85% of our patients, whether they are telling us or not. And what does it include? So integrative medicine actually, in my mind, includes all of this. So natural products like supplements are things we get questions about a lot, herbs, but it also includes nutrition, how to eat right, mind-body practices, yoga, Tai Chi, acupuncture, but you see here exercise. And then there are some other aspects of integrative medicine that we're really not going to talk about today, particularly Ayurveda, homeopathy. The evidence really is not there that they're beneficial in these cases. So I want to talk about the health dangers of cruciferous vegetables. They contain goitrogens that interfere with iodine uptake. They can suppress your thyroid, leading to fatigue, depression, and weight gain. There's one type that we think causes bladder cancer. Sulforaphane in cruciferous vegetables actually damages intracellular structures, increasing reactive oxygen species and depleting glutathione. It's loaded with formaldehyde from oxidation. It's not really organic because natural pesticides that have been shown to cause cancer. There's no monitoring system. It leads to adrenal fatigue. Apparently, apple cider vinegar, vitamin B17, and SEACT help detox it. So everything I just said is complete nonsense. And I wanted to point that out because what I've noticed over the last 5 to 10 years as information has become more and more available is that our patients are scared, and so they are looking for information. They're going on the internet, they're talking to other people, and often the information they're getting is wonderful, useful information for their day to day, and often it's not just useless but potentially dangerous information. So just some of the things I'm listing over here, they really have no place in cancer treatment or really in much else. Many patients have come to me with various aspects of these treatments on the left, and remember that the amount of energy necessary to refute lies is an order of magnitude bigger than to produce them. So it's a lot easier to spread misinformation than the truth. So I always tell patients that while it's important to arm yourself with information, you do want to obtain it from multiple accredited sources and confer with healthcare providers, and make sure you speak with your team before you do anything to discuss your individual needs, as not everyone's diagnosis and treatment is the same. And particularly in breast cancer, there are a multitude of different treatments and subtypes, and do not assume that one that a patient who may have something you think is similar really has the same subtype or treatment regimen as you. But also, don't be afraid to ask questions and advocate for yourself. As an aside, researchers at Yale recently noted an almost 6 times greater risk of death in breast cancer patients who use complementary and alternative medicine instead of. So this is the alternative approach. So the NCCN established a few years back, for the first time ever, guidelines, really just around healthy lifestyle, diet rich in plant-based foods, processed meats, sugar, alcohol. So we'll talk about all of this. But one thing we hear a lot, and what I actually just said earlier, is ask your doctor, ask your healthcare team. And while this is something that commercials will tell us to do, or support groups will tell you to do, what's interesting, and what I think is little known about medical training, is that we learn a lot about disease. We learn about diagnosing disease, managing disease, treating it, curing it, but we really don't learn a lot about health. The example I showed here, in my 10 years of medical training after college, 0.4% of it went into nutrition and exercise. It was a couple of weeks, a course in the winter, and I think barely 10% of the medical school class actually attended. So why is this important? We think one of the reasons is it has to do with something called epigenetics. This is sort of a busy slide, but I think it's important just to think about what epigenetics really is. So epigenetics is changes in the gene that are not due to changes in the sequence of the DNA. So there's a few of these mechanisms here, but the other way to look at it is how your cells actually read your genes. If you give 5 architects 5 blueprints, you're not really going to get 5 identical houses. So to begin, nutrition. Many of us still think about the food pyramid, but almost a decade ago, the American Institute of Cancer Research developed what is now known as the New American Plate. And it is based on portion and proportion. And you can see here sort of the transition from on the left to what we had recommended years ago to on the right, what's recommended now, where now more plant-based, non-starchy vegetables, smaller section of protein, a little larger section of vegetables. The AICR, by the way, has a wonderful website. And they also list here foods that fight cancer. And each and every one has evidence behind it and why. And again, this is not to say that one should consider that grapes and raspberries will treat a cancer, but we do know that diets that are rich in a lot of these sorts of foods seem to be the kind that in population-based studies may decrease the risk of cancer. We also know on the other side that certain foods seem to increase cancer risk. So processed meats were put on the map a few years ago when the World Health Organization's International Agency on the Research of Cancer listed processed meats as a Category 1 carcinogen. Category 1 is asbestos, tobacco, benzene. It does not mean that 2 slices of bacon is equal to a pack of cigarettes, but it does mean that the evidence linking processed meats to certain cancers is as strong as the evidence that was linking tobacco to lung cancer. Charred meats, many of us have heard about, lead to the production of carcinogenic compounds. There might even be a substance in red meat that promotes inflammation and carcinogenesis, even without cooking it a certain way. I think sugar is the one that gets a lot of attention. I would say upwards of a third to a half of patients I see will say that sugar feeds cancer, and once they're diagnosed, they need to completely eliminate sugar from their diet. I think both those statements are likely missing the broader point, but certainly sugar is a problem in the American diet. You can see upwards of 66 pounds a year at this point for the average person. But it's not so much sugar feeds cancer. It's that sugar, particularly refined sugar, or what we call simple carbohydrates or simple starchy carbohydrates, what they do is when you when you have um, two slices of white bread, or you have a candy bar or a cupcake, it quickly gets digested and broken down into glucose. And then all that glucose gets absorbed into your bloodstream, which then leads to a rapid rise in the hormone insulin. That's known as the insulin spike. And it's the insulin spike that we think leads to problems. So insulin normally is a really important hormone for many things, particularly blood sugar control. But when insulin gets above a certain level, it leads to various issues. In our breast cancer patients, we think there's a connection with mental health. So, for example, things like chemo brain in older patients, potentially even issues with cognition, and in our menopausal patients, increased anxiety and even depressive symptoms. We know that it's insulin spikes that have a direct connection to weight gain, because as insulin goes up and up, it promotes the storage of fat. And then finally, from a cancer perspective, there's a hormone known as IGF-1, which increases production when insulin goes above a certain level. By the way, there's no credible evidence that artificial sweeteners, that's a question we get a lot, cause cancer. But my feeling is artificial sweeteners really don't allow you to break the addiction to sugar. But for the most part, particularly in small amounts, they are safe. But just to mention this IGF-1 connection, so there is this condition. It's known as Lebron Syndrome. Most people have never heard of it. There's only about 4,000 or 5,000 people in the world that have it. It leads to a malfunction in the receptor for growth hormone. And when that happens, there's almost no production of IGF-1. Now, IGF-1 is important in puberty, so most of these patients tend to be quite short in stature. But what's interesting about Lebron's patients is in a few thousand patients with this syndrome, there's almost zero incidence of cancer. The worldwide incidence is actually 1 in 3. What's also interesting, even though their BMIs are a little higher, there's almost no diabetes. So IGF-1 is an important hormone and still being looked at, and has been looked at for years, particularly in breast cancer. What about alcohol? Well, we know alcohol has direct links to various cancers, but there is a fairly direct connection, it appears, with breast cancer, particularly in breast cancer survivors. The UK Million Women study showed that for every serving increase per day, there was a 12% increased risk. So one serving, which is actually about 12 grams or so, is 12 ounces of beer, 5 ounces of wine, and a shot of liquor. It was also shown in Black women breast cancer survivors that more than 7 servings a week, which is really just one a night, that's coming home from work and having 1 glass of wine a night, increased recurrence risk by 15%. And then if those women increase to 2 a night, a 33% increased risk. We're not quite sure why alcohol does this, but one of the potential links appears to be with estrogen, that it may activate the estrogen receptor without estrogen, sort of the skeleton key in the estrogen lock. What about organic? Organic food is again, questions we get a lot about. Should I eat organic? Should I only eat organic? Is organic better for me? At this point, it's difficult to say that the organic diet is actually more nutritious. There's really not a lot of evidence that shows that it's more nutritious. In terms of its cancer connection, in 2018 was the first sort of larger study that showed that an organic diet appeared to decrease cancer risk. Now, these were healthy volunteers, mostly women. Average age was 44, so this was a younger population, and they broke patients up into groups of organic food intake. And what they found is that those women that had the highest intake had a 25% reduction in cancer risk versus those with the lowest intake. it's also important to remember organic, that word actually does mean something, but even there's 100% organic, and a few other phrases. But words like natural, free range, simple, real, they really don't mean anything, and there's no standards attached to them. So be careful with those. And then most breast cancer patients have seen this, but this is the Dirty Dozen. So the Environmental Working Group, which is a nonprofit, also a wonderful website to look at, the EWG. They put together every year a list of the 12 crops that have the highest pesticide, or actually herbicide content. So in other words, these are the ones, if you're thinking about going organic and you want bang for your buck, these are the ones that are that you should try to get organic. So what they do is they actually wash the vegetables the way you would at home, and then they test the skin and test the flesh. Contrary, on the other side of this is the clean 15. So 15 crops that are the cleanest, and you really don't need organic. But why is organic important from a cancer perspective? Well, we think one of the reasons it has to do with GMOs. So GMOs are something we've heard a lot about, but what are they? So they're genetically modified organisms. And to some extent, that's important because in parts of the world where the crop yield is low, modifying the crop to increase harvest really helps feed large populations. However, they can also be modified to be resistant to herbicides. So they really simplify weed management. And as you see there, crop dusting plain can then just spray the weed killer over the entire field and not really worry that the crop will die. Only the weeds will die. The problem is the crop that absorbs the weed killer. And if the weed killer has some substances in it that are dangerous, we now have a potential connection with cancer. So the IARC deemed glyphosate, which is an ingredient in the most common weed killer used in this country, as a probable human carcinogen. It does appear to increase risk of lymphoma, and at least in vitro, in the lab, up to a 13-fold increased growth of estrogen-positive breast cancer. Just a few months ago, a large company that shall be unnamed agreed to settle over 100,000 claims for over $10 billion that its weed killer caused cancer. Again, this is not to tell patients that if they happen to use a weed killer, all of a sudden they're going to get breast cancer. It's just on a population perspective, if we want to live healthier lives, particularly breast cancer survivors, this is an important point and important part of daily life that should be considered. I've mentioned the IARC a couple of times, so just to elaborate a little bit, it was founded in 1965 as an arm of the WHO, and their job is to conduct and coordinate research into causes of cancer. So they look at all sorts of chemicals and medications and drugs, and those are the lists. That's the list of that they divide it into. So group 1 is the known carcinogens, and then 2A is the probables. And then 3 and 4 really don't appear to have much of a connection as yet. Breast cancer patients, our patients often ask about personal care products, cosmetics, what's dangerous, what's not. So the European Union several years ago passed a cosmetics directive that banned so far over 1,300 chemicals in their products. So their companies, they are not allowed to have these products in the things they sell. The US has banned a grand total of 11 chemicals, not 1,100. It's because the European Union and Canada, to a large extent, operate under what's known as the precautionary principle. And the US really says buyers beware. To break it down, essentially, the US assumes that a chemical is safe until it's proven dangerous. The EU says the chemical is dangerous until it's proven safe. So it's a different default, and the burden of proof in Europe is actually on the manufacturer to make the claim about safety. with the United States, the burden of proof is on the EPA that a chemical is unsafe. And disclosure issues to the public are also a huge problem in this country versus others. This is a list of items in personal care products that may have some link to certain cancers. Rather than trying to memorize lists like this, what I often tell patients to do is really try to pick companies that are doing the right thing, that are making products that adhere to the better standards, the higher standards of the EU. And there are several out there, and they can be researched. And this way you don't have to remember, because they are doing the right thing. And it is the more informed consumer that leads to that kind of economic pressure, which makes companies then want to change how they do things. In terms of the home, other things just to mention, simple things you can do. Avoid plastics if you can, but if you have to, make sure they're BPA and BPH free. Don't microwave plastics, even if this is 20 seconds. When you have cleaning supplies, if they have a danger or poison label, sounds obvious, but maybe not the ones you want to use. You can also make your own if you have the time and are so inclined. It's fairly simple. Non-stick pans can be replaced. Sunscreens are a big one. Use ones that have zinc oxide or titanium dioxide, not oxybenzone. Other things like organic dry cleaners and cracking windows and washing your hands. And all sorts of other simple things that you can do in your home to avoid exposures. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about obesity. Again, from the connection with cancer, obesity is known as a disease of civilization, meaning it's something that really wasn't seen in eras past, but has become a much bigger problem now. And really, we're starting to see not just developed nations, but developing nations dealing with this dual crisis of both malnutrition and obesity, which is a huge public health issue. But what is it? What is obese? So these are the BMI cutoffs for obesity. When I gave a similar talk in India at a medical school, a medical student reminded me that the cutoffs in India and actually most of Asia are not what we have here. So normal for them ends at about 23, not 25, which means that if we use that cutoff, about 88% of our population would be overweight. Currently, it's 72% are overweight, 40% are obese, and then 9% are in the class 3, or what we call morbidly obese. Obviously, different increased risks as the classes of obesity increase. And the rates in Black and white adults are different. In non-Hispanic Black adults, you see there on the left, the rates of obesity are fairly high in those states in dark red. But what is the cancer link? We know there does appear to be some connection to breast cancer. Clearly, we've known that for years. And we don't think it's one thing. I mean, there's clearly insulin resistance, as I spoke about, but there's all sorts of other issues related to inflammation, formation of new blood vessels, et cetera. I would say that most oncologists, outside of questions around the actual treatment, the chemotherapy or the hormone therapies, supplements are the things we get questioned about a lot, particularly in my practice, particularly when I see patients for integrative oncology visits. I won't be talking specifically about supplements. That's a whole separate conversation that can be had, but it is important to remember that we do use natural products for many conditions, like you see here. But these three labels, look for these labels. You know, there's a lot of companies out there, and it's hard to choose which one you might want for your vitamin D or for your probiotic. But these three labels, the National Science Foundation, the US Pharmacopoeia, and Consumer Labs, They are independent organizations that test supplements voluntarily, and will prove that it's that the dose is the dose on the in the bottle. And in case most people don't recognize her, UU2 is the scientist with no MD nor PhD. She's 87 years old now, I believe. A few years ago, she won the Nobel Prize in Medicine for the discovery of artemisinin. She was the lead scientist during the Vietnam War when Chairman Mao's North Vietnamese troops were being decimated in the jungles by malaria. So he charged this team to come up with a cure. And she brought this old Chinese text, 1700-year-old text, the title being Emergency Prescriptions Kept Up One Sleeve. And she translated it and figured out that the wormwood plant had a chemical that dealt with fevers. And through that, she was able to isolate artemisinin, tested it on herself first, and ultimately figured out the treatment that today is still the most effective therapy for Plasmodium falciparum, which is the most deadly species of malaria. Exercise. I want to mention this. I was a personal trainer before I was a physician, and this is something I would see a lot. Patients taking an elevator to the Stairmaster. Physical activity is important. I don't know if we need to emphasize that anymore, but clearly it's important in reducing cancer risk, breast cancer in particular. The term sitting disease was coined by the American Cancer Society a few years back, and in a large study of healthy volunteers found that as a woman, if you sat more than 6 hours a day versus those who sat less than 3, those women who sat more had an almost twice as likely risk of death from cancer and heart disease than the ones who sat less than 3. So what was interesting was even those who exercised had the same consequences of sitting. So the idea is it's not about the gut busting workout necessarily, but it's just constant activity is what's important. And along those lines, it really isn't about going to a gym and sweating it out, but it's the things you can do every day. It's the things that you can do for 150 minutes a week. Moderate intensity, which is you can talk but you can't sing. And remember to start slow, and there's lots of ways to increase activity. Even a 1 flight of stairs. I have a patient who comes in for chemotherapy. She'll park her car on the 9th floor of the garage, but depending on how she feels that day, when she comes in, she takes the elevator up a certain number of flights and walks the rest. Sometimes it's 8 flights, sometimes it's none. When it comes to exercise, remember it's not just cardiovascular. Resistance exercise, particularly in postmenopausal women, is important, particularly those on aromatase inhibitors as bone density drops. Understanding how to do resistance exercise properly helps strengthen bone, build muscle, and of course, flexibility is important all around. And I think we all make excuses, but in the end, it's really up to you to decide what you're willing to do that day. I think commitment, the idea of commitment is you're willing to do something that you don't want to do, but you said you were going to do it. So ultimately, it's nothing that we can make anyone do, but individuals have to decide for themselves. Yoga, as we know, has value in many aspects of life, from fatigue, breathing, sleep, anxiety. In breast cancer, clearly it's been shown to improve quality of life, physical and emotional well-being. And finally, stress. I want to mention, this is the hardest thing to define. What is stress? John Steinbeck said, a sad soul can kill you far quicker than a germ. And it is a state of mental tension. It's caused by anxiety and worry in work, family, relationships, finances, health. And when we actually test women with psychological evaluations, we find that a lot of women who have gone through breast cancer treatment have PTSD-like symptoms, and we're not really diagnosing it. And it's important to remember that stress doesn't just have physiologic issues, but it leads to high risk behaviors like overeating, smoking, drinking. It leads to problems in relationships. Um, and there's lots of data that shows that chronic stress has negative health impact. This, for example, is a study in mice that showed that mice exposed to chronic stress had 30-fold higher rate of metastasis of breast cancer cells in non-stressed mice. You'll find a multitude of studies that show potential links. Again, it is not to say that stress causes breast cancer, but we know that stress creates an environment that is conducive to inflammation and other potential issues that have a negative impact on health. So lots of things are important for stress reduction, like we mentioned, but cancer and its treatment lead to all sorts of stress, as we said. Acupuncture, guided imagery, mindfulness is something that can be done and learned fairly easily. But in the end, how do you find balance? There is a book written by a psychologist, Kelly Turner. Many of you know the book. It's called Radical Remission. She was interested in really looking at patients who were, quote, miracle cures. These were the patients who had a diagnosis of cancer, and their oncology team had said that that they weren't going to be cured, or they were difficult to treat, and yet they did well. Now, many of these stories probably need to be delved into a little more, but what was interesting was she found that there was some common threads between these patients. For example, they embraced positive emotions, let go of negative ones, creating a social support network, volunteering, doing for others, trusting your intuition, connecting with your spirituality. And this idea of finding the why, whatever it is, what is it that keeps you going, and understanding what it is and using it to power you through. And that can change over time. Other simple things that can be done, listening to music. I think the only time most of us ever listen to music is on the ride to work or the ride back. But it can be therapeutic. There's an entire field of therapy related to music. Even just something as simple as sitting quietly for 10 minutes. It's hard to do. But if you can find those 10 minutes and starting your day correctly with a little mindfulness, it can benefit you for the duration of that day. And then ultimately find something that brings you joy. For me personally, I love stand-up comedy. It's been tough during COVID, as those are all canceled. But I look forward to when that's back. But that's often what I do when I come to work. I won't listen to music. I'll listen to the comedy stations that on the radio. I also love pitching to my son. My son is now 6'2" and is hits the ball pretty hard. So I just have to protect myself a little better than I used to. So I want to thank you for the attention. This wasn't meant to be a plug, but this is my book, After Cancer Care, really just about how to live life after cancer. I think the important point here is that as a conventional breast medical oncologist, seeing hundreds of patients with breast cancer, I give chemotherapy all the time. I recommend standard therapies, radiation, endocrine therapies, biologic therapies, and immunotherapies. But I also believe that if that's all we do, I think we're missing an opportunity to help people. And I think it's incumbent upon practitioners to understand a little bit about what our patients are interested in, which is how to be healthy. We're not just thinking about fixing a disease, but we're thinking about making people better. So thank you again.